This is gonna get me in hot water.
So recently, beloved creator Madisyn Brown posted a video titled, "Everyone's Got Autism Now," and apparently, so do I. Just by the title alone and being a frequent watcher of Madisyn, I could guess what the points were gonna be about before even watching the video. Amongst other things, this video was going over the increasing acceptance of self-diagnosis on the internet, particularly TikTok, which is popularly known as the platform where ideas go to die.
And with this uptick in autism content, a lot of people have been diagnosing themselves with autism or speculating that they themselves may have autism on TikTok or speculating that other people, influencers, celebrities have autism.
She opens by introducing where the idea for this discussion came from. Essentially, she posted a video on TikTok about enjoying personal solitude, and people in her comment sections were cheekily suggesting that she maybe should look into autism. She goes on to lament on this experience before getting into the meat of the subject. She examines the uptake in relatable content that utilizes autism as a basis.
I can't keep my mouth shut anymore. With 10 signs you might have autism videos or the kid with autism sound going around on TikTok, I understand why people are doing this because even watching these videos myself, I'm starting to think I have autism.
She provides several examples that she did not explicitly speculate on whether the creators actually had autism, but I am going to say that is how a lot of audience members read that sentiment. And we'll get into the comment section a little later in this video. She provides what she believed to be accurate information on signs of autism sourced by the CDC. That way we won't have to seemingly have the inaccurate information provided by various TikTok accounts.
Now for clarity, so you aren't getting autistic information from TikTok, here are some symptoms of autism according to the CDC. Avoids or does not keep eye contact, does not respond to name by 9 months of age.
She then compares the rise of autistic-focused content to that of the Tumblr age commodifying of mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety.
So the rise in autism, if you even want to call it that, kind of reminds me of when anxiety and depression started to be more openly talked about and then gravely overused and misused to a point where people were taking it on as a personality trait or even an aesthetic, thank you Tumblr, rather than an actual disorder that needs to be treated and isn't just something that makes you different or unique or something you can put on a t-shirt to be relatable.
We also find out that Madisyn is an advocate for gatekeeping autism.
Honestly, maybe we should. Now that I think about it, maybe we should gatekeep autism. I think there are certain things in this world that we should be allowed to gatekeep, and I feel like autism might be one of those things, you know? In 2023, we're gatekeeping autism and bamboo earrings.
She closes the video out with postulations on the possible reasons for certain people self-diagnosing, which includes the desire for impression points and also for community. There are several reasons why people felt uncomfortable by this video, and I'm not one of those people who were made to feel uncomfortable because I'm not a part of the demographics that she inadvertently heard, meaning autistic, trans, or non-binary people. But even so, upon my first watch of this video, I tried to understand why I felt like something was missing from this video aside from the poor sourcing. That is when I dropped down into the comment section to see what was going on there. You see, when you're not a part of a group or community that has been upset, you may miss out on some perspectives if you're just going by your own. This is something that I have said time and time again. We must listen to others before having the gumption to speak out. My video is structurally something from the perspective of someone who wants to learn more about the lived experiences of others in order to broaden my understanding of certain conversations. Most of my initial opinions come from purely academic and sterile basis because I am a logic-driven person. The key points I have seen discussed in Madisyn's comment section are as follows: the sourcing, the confusion in her tone and messaging, and her unintended overspeaking of the autistic community. The points where the tone of the video is confusing is exemplified at several points, but the main one called out in her comment section was her cheeky way of stating that we should gatekeep autism.
In 2023, we're gatekeeping autism and bamboo earrings. Yeah. Like, of course, more the merrier. I'm sure people with autism feel a bit of relief now that the discussion around it has become more normalized, and maybe they feel less alienated because more people are realizing that they're on the spectrum, or they're more open to talking about it. The problem is when it's being taken to an absolute extreme where it's not enough to understand, learn about, and empathize with those with autism. No, we have to be people with autism.
Now, I read this point as her wanting to offer more protections to the autistic community so they are not oversaturated by those who may be inauthentically representing themselves as autistic. However, those a part of said community had other thoughts. There are several comments stating that gatekeeping should not be encouraged because the hardships people may face in obtaining a professional diagnosis, including but not limited to financial status, gender, or sex, as well as the potential barriers of losing control over one's own life. This commenter stated, with a professional diagnosis of ASD, a person would be unable to serve in the U.S. military or obtain citizenship in Australia.
But a diagnosis of autism has halted his plans, disqualifying him from the armed forces.
Individuals with high-functioning autism are human beings that should be given the opportunity to pursue whatever they want.
Through certain comments and additional research, I learned that self-diagnosing is actually well accepted within the autistic community. According to a 2017 study titled A Mixed Method Study of Barriers to Formal Diagnosis of Autism Spectrum Disorder in Adults, the primary factors of adults who suspect they may have autism via self-diagnosing, but also experiencing barriers in obtaining a professional diagnosis are the following: anxiety, access to ASD specialists, fear of not being believed along with a mistrust in healthcare professionals, the inability to describe the symptoms, stigma, and several other reasons that differ depending on numerous variables. Another commenter stated that autistic people do not understand the complexities of autism and often speak on the alleged trend of autism bandwagoning, for lack of better phrasing, without giving much regard to the actual needs of autistic individuals. I saw extensive discussion regarding the systemic issues of diagnosing women with autism within the psychology profession and the difficulties some have to overcome because of this challenge. These are all very notable critiques because while they are all often said in reference to other communities, it doesn't seem to be something we all consider when speaking on the autistic community. Most of us have learned to be more considerate in our language and tone when discussing racial or sexuality related disparities, but I must admit this level of care is not always lent to this particular group of people. I've wondered why that may be, and the answer is not as complex as I thought it would be. Most of us, especially in abstract academia, have learned to understand autism in a manner that made it seem as if it lessened the quality of one's life. We have been taught to look at autistic people as if they are childlike and incapable. This is something that I have personally observed many times in law. For example, in DT versus MT, the mother, denoted here as VT, sought sole custody of the child she shared with DT, the father, and one of the reasons she cited was that the father suffers from severe autism and cannot appropriately care for himself or the child. In this particular case, the father had to go out of his way to actively prove this was not true. We have been taught to view autism as a trait that is less than, and our actions often reflect those teachings, even as more research is conducted in actively disproving these stereotypical teachings. This was a large factor in the APA making autism a spectrum. In order to break down this type of misunderstanding of autism, as holistic people, we must bring humanity back into the conversation by listening. And if you're a person who struggles with empathy, we have to constantly refresh our knowledge base. When Madisyn attempts to break down the reasonings as to why people, specifically white people, would want to latch onto the autistic community, she is again met with backlash due to her tone.
I'm not autistic, and I certainly do not speak for autistic people, but I have to imagine that maybe some of them find it a bit odd or frustrating that people are trying to position themselves in the autistic community when they don't actually have autism. As social justice has become more widely accepted and discussed in our culture, more and more people want skin in the game of the oppression Olympics.
One of her theories include that white people lack true community.
White Americans tend to lack a strong connection to a rich culture that is dare I say, wholesome. They rely on new wave forms of identity to feel a sense of community and a sense of self.
This might sound like a hot take, but I feel like the internet's obsession with uniqueness is causing legitimate brain rot in some people. There's no reason why something like mental illness, for example, should be turned into this commodity where you get internet points or social currency by being different. It's like by trying to break the stigma, we've just come full circle where now nobody knows what the hell any of these words actually mean.
She references a TikTok video while making her point. And I remember seeing this exact video on TikTok and giggling at it because I do agree with it. But to Madisyn's point, and this is nothing that I saw someone readily comment on, but I wholeheartedly disagree with the assertion that white people are no longer the center of all discussions.
When we talk about Black Lives Matter or trans rights, I genuinely believe that there are white people out there who kind of go, well, what about me? They kind of struggle with that because they're not the center of attention as much anymore.
They probably shouldn't be, but they are the majority, at least in the States. And if we want to see true change occur, we must all engage with white people to ensure their understandings are aligning with the marginalized. This is why I constantly say I'm an advocate for open discussion for all and with all. We get nowhere with constantly telling people to shut up, except for a bunch of performativity, subtle racism, and new phobias. Our freedoms are not achieved despite others, they are achieved because of them. This notion may be very disillusioning to some, but it is reality. It is the consequences of living in a bureaucratic nation.
So, with the rise of social justice and identity politics, people find solace, I think, in being non-binary or, in this case, neurodivergent.
It is funny Madisyn should mention identity politics in this discussion in reference to autism, because identity politics are the very reason why psychology tends to shift. Identity politics are the manner in which people of similar groups collaborate when seeking a common goal. It challenges the status quo of many fields like Western psychology, which has traditionally focused solely on white people. That is not to say that psychology, depending on the type and the branch, does not consider the perspectives of differing backgrounds, but it is to say that Western psychological analysis has historically mishandled intersectionality. And I'm not referring to only race. The people critiquing Madisyn in her comment section are actually inadvertently pointing this out. Another messaging issue revolves around her reference to gender being a choice.
But I think there is more of an element of choice when it comes to gender identity. I mean, if I wanted to identify as non-binary and change my pronouns to she, they tomorrow, I very well could. But I cannot change being Black.
People critiqued her on invalidating the identities of mainly non-binary people who stated their gender identity is not a choice, much like homo and bisexuality are not choices. Commenters argue that gender identity is less of a conscious decision than it is a hard wiring within one's innate being. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I don't think that is what Madisyn meant, or at least that's not the conclusion I came to despite the point not being well articulated. When she stated she could change her pronouns tomorrow if she wanted to, but she cannot readily change being Black, my perception is that she was stating that while white people can identify with different communities, they will still not be met with the same visceral reactions and systemic issues that Black people face. When it comes to identities that are not readily perceived by the average person, there is a strong inclination for them to treat you as they already perceive you rather than as your actual identity dictates. This commenter very eloquently stated, I do want to say that the way you're treated and live life as a trans person has a lot to do with how others perceive you. If you're outwardly gender divergent, there's a good chance you'll be denied a lot of work, housing, opportunities, connections, etc. I know that you were mostly talking about the white non-binary people that pass as cisgender and try to be the loudest at the Impression Olympics, but I wanted to bring that level of nuance to what you're saying, because if you're a trans person that does not pass as cisgender, there are a lot of social inequalities set up for you to fail. It's really sad that the co-opting of all these identities is leading them to being so watered down and not taken seriously anymore. It's like every mental illness and gender identity is just a joke now. Now, regarding the conversation of autism, when autistic people do not behave in stereotypical manners, most people do not readily perceive them as such. And when the person does announce their diagnosis for more context and better understanding of what mainstream society would see as idiosyncrasies, the outside person may still revert to treating them as they originally did because the perceptions of the autistic person still do not align with their stereotypical understandings. Most of the time, the average person cannot tell if someone is autistic or not, or if someone is non-binary or not. unless they give in to harmful stereotypes. That said, because the identity is sometimes not readily perceived by an outside individual, if the person in question is white, they will normally still receive the same access and privileges that are afforded to white people. Even without intersectionality, Black and brown people do not have that same sort of gray area because your perceptions of us are already being formed upon your first glance at us. Typically, it takes a little bit more time and active conversation for a bias to be formed and showcased towards a white non-binary person or a white autistic person who does not look the part. And because of those factors, because of that true nuance, the experiences will always differ. This is what I personally gleaned from Madisyn's point, and I do realize this seems to ignore the existence of Black and brown, non-binary, and autistic individuals, but I'd be willing to say that she is very aware of these individuals' existence. She simply wasn't relating her point to them at that time. I think she specifically wanted to discuss white people and their intersecting identities. Her underlying theory was that some white people who deeply desire to be seen and heard, have a tendency to co-opt certain communities and identities in order to be seen as more valid by our ever-changing society. This is something that is very observable in not only white people, but in any society where the marginalized begin to interject more into conversations and relentlessly demand equity. You can reference the emergence of agnosticism or spirituality as opposed to Christianity in the United States. When those in power, or the corresponding groups that represent those in power, feel as if they are being called out or challenged, there is often a response to trying to align themselves with minority groups in any way they can to prove their allyship and empathy. It is a misguided response, and it is a response that should not be celebrated or praised, but it should be talked about. And I am not sure why the default to packing this phenomenon amongst others is always linked to trans issues. We probably need to stop using trans people and trans issues as our examples for everything. When I think of this problem, my mind immediately turns to classism and feminism, but that's just me. Madisyn's point of not conflating racialized experiences with non-binary experiences, particularly white non-binary people, is correct.
But I just don't think it's appropriate to conflate certain issues with others when it's obviously like systemic issues versus like someone misgendered me at the grocery store. Not that it's a competition, but I feel like sometimes they do want it to be a competition. These people are the loudest in the room. They need to be heard. They need to let you know that they too experience oppression. And I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do. I'm not invalidating anybody who is gender fluid or gender queer and has experienced any sort of backlash or ignorance or prejudice. But I think sometimes it's almost like, well, I get an excuse. I get a pass. I'm a good white because I am a they, them. I know struggle.
They are not the same. The histories are not the same. The systemic issues are not the same. The way people in each group are treated are not the same. So we should not speak on them as if they are similar or as if the impact is received similarly. But her tone is not conducive to a real conversation.
You guys know I'm not trying to like hurt anybody's feelings or attack anybody. That's genuinely not at all what I'm doing. And if you take that away from this video, I'm sorry. I believe that is a personal choice.
She claims to not want to invalidate non-binary people. However, as this commenter puts it, it isn't appropriate to tell others how they should feel about your video and its messaging. I understand you may not have had overt malicious intentions, but this video was not well researched for many reasons that have already been iterated in the comment section. Even if your intent was not to harm, you've clearly missed the mark in some places. You cannot condescend to people and then tell them to not be offended and expect them to listen to you. I've said it in past videos and I will say it again and I will continue to say it. If we want to have conversations, we need to act like it. And if we don't want to have conversations, if we just want to vent, rage, and talk at people, then just say that. Let it be known. But Black people, Black women have experienced disparities since the day we were born. In the peak of socio-political discourse, modern day Black people are being heard and seen because they have fought for that ability. endlessly. Imagine our surprise when the concept of non-binary became popularized. A valid concept, yes, but a concept that inarguably attracts white people. A concept that is faced by white people in non-queer spaces. And we've all observed how quickly the US government was to push out action by offering the gender marker of X on government documentation in 2022. That was a fantastic action, and I was excited for anyone who felt seen by that act. However, as a Black woman in law and the medical field, I was stricken by how quick legislation was put into place for this type of issue, especially when you compare it to something like the Crown Act of 2020, which barred the discrimination of hair texture. This act should have passed decades ago. The conversation surrounding the discrimination Black people face regarding our hair was not new. It has something that has been heavily discussed since the 60s, maybe even prior. You cannot deny the speed in which legislation took to supporting non-binary people had nothing to do with the fact that white people, well, politically respectable white people, are heavily intertwined within that community. And by politically acceptable, I mean white people who have none of the stereotypical attributes of markers of being outrightly queer. So not obviously being in a non-hetero relationship, no flamboyance, no androgyny, those kind of stereotypes. This is not the fault of the non-binary community. It is the fault of oppressive systems that are always more ready to jump on performative actions for sectors of white Americans than it is to actually implement true systemic change. And that cannot be left unaddressed simply because it makes people uncomfortable. Another point of concern was the sourcing of Madisyn's video. The central point of contention is when she references an organization called Autism Speaks, which has a documented history of not being that great per the autistic community.
Autism is 4 times more likely to appear in boys than girls, but it seems, according to what I've seen on the internet, that young women are less likely to be diagnosed with autism simply based off of their gender and their appearance.
I have a few additional critiques on the sourcing aside from this one, but we'll start here. For those who are unaware, Autism Speaks is one of the nation's leading autism organizations. However, over the years, they have been called out for the following: not having autistic people on their board, not providing enough aid to the autistic community despite the massive amounts of monies under their control, adding to the stigma of autism with examples like this clip from a movie called Autism Every Day that the group sponsored.
I had sat in the car for about 15 minutes and actually contemplated putting Jody in the car and driving off the George Washington Bridge. It's only because of Lauren, the fact that I have another child, that I probably didn't do it.
It is also worth noting that the channel that published this clip is called Wrong Planet, which is also a web community designed for those who are on the spectrum and their allies. Autism Speaks has also been called out for seeking research to cure autism, as well as pursuing the creation of prenatal tests that would capture autism in utero. The latter was admittedly hard for me to understand why it was a negative, but that is because I'm not a part of the community of people affected. According to some within the autistic community, advocating for a cure to autism indicates that there is something wrong or inherently abnormal with being on the spectrum. The desire for a cure lends to the stigma surrounding ASD and leads autistic people to regarding it as some sort of debilitating disease. This is why we always need to listen to those who are affected before making a steadfast conclusion. It can be hard to find sourcing information that is not from an organization that claims to be an advocate for a certain group of people, but is also very heavily criticized by those very groups of people. But when you introduce research into your video essays and state it as pure fact, you are telling people, hey, I vetted this information and the sourcing. We're all gonna take some L's here and there because we all fuck up, but it helps to know that the person who is fucking up does not have any ill will or ill intent. And it would seem Madisyn's intentions were unclear to some. In Madisyn's comment section, I saw people critiquing her use of language as well when she says things like people with autism. According to this commentary, there is a distinction between saying people with autism, which is person first language, and saying autistic people, which is identity first language. According According to the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN, in the autism community, many self-advocates and their allies prefer terminologies such as autistic, autistic person, or autistic individual, because we understand autism is an inherent part of an individual's identity. And the reason I'm using this organization as a reference is because when I researched them, I didn't see article after article popping up denouncing them, which was my experience with Autism Speaks. I was also able to review their action items on their webpage and see how they are claiming to directly have impacted the community in great detail. In addition to this, they offer a large amount of resources from numerous autistic people on how to specifically address autistic people. According to some of these essays, some people prefer person-first language and others are okay with interchangeability. This is pretty similar to how some Black people prefer to be called African Americans, while people like me simply prefer to be called Black. There's a general consensus in the Black community that a majority of us are good with just being called Black, but we should always remain cognizant of differing opinions because no group is a monolith. Aside from her use of information from Autism Speaks, I wanted to talk about her referencing the CDC for information as well. The CDC's purpose is not to so much extensively educate the American populace so much as it is to collaborate with the experts that actually do that and more. The CDC provides collections of baseline information and statistical data for certain conditions, disorders, and diseases. Because of that, their information regarding autism is and will always be incomplete by design. The CDC's information of ASD is primarily focused on children, which is one of the most vulnerable demographics in the world, which is why a heavy emphasis is put on them in this blurb. It was not appropriate to deem this as 100% relevant information when the examples used in the video were of adults and teens seemingly self-diagnosing or just discussing their experiences. The manner in which autistic symptoms manifest in adults can profoundly differ to the symptoms exhibited in children, especially in women who are often either misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed. Rather than choosing the first link presented on the Google search engine when you're trying to research a topic, I would lean more into appropriate academia to gather my bases, like the APA, who I do have issues with, but they do provide a number of open source and peer-reviewed information on multiple subjects. Academia is a good starting point, but we always need to pair it with first-hand experiences as well, because studies and experiments will contain bias that you may not immediately clock since you're not a part of the community. And if you're someone who cannot connect with academia or feels like it's a little too much to digest, then I would turn to community-driven organizations that are recommended by whatever community you're researching. Accessible and digestible materials always need to be made available to the general populace so we can begin to understand the communities that we are not a part of. As stated by the American Psychiatric Association, autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is a complex developmental condition. It is complex. Emphasis on the complex. And if we want to talk about societal implications in relation to it, we have some learning to do. This last conversation is not particular to the autistic community, but it is very much relevant. Madisyn has been accused of overspeaking the community of people she desired to defend. I've seen comments that either said or insinuated that Madisyn should not be speaking on the topic because she herself is not autistic. The notion of overspeaking comes from the idea of a person not directly impacted by certain issues elevating their own voices and opinions above all others. For returning viewers, you guys know that I am not of the opinion that societal level conversations should exclusively be kept within whatever community. We do open communication on this channel, and we accept when we are wrong or lacking information, or we accept when we just plainly disagree with one another. Societally speaking, there is utility in a video like Madisyn's. Maybe she got a significant amount of backlash for publishing it, but most of the comments were respectful, kind, and seeking to offer additional perspective. There were a lot of great conversations going on, and that is why people who are not a part of certain communities should continue to give their perspectives on select topics. It helps to narrow down where there has been confusion, miscommunication, or a simple lack of awareness. When speaking on or about others, we have to be okay with being wrong. This is not an advocacy for hateful or completely uneducated rhetoric, of course. It's just being aware that conversations cannot be one-sided. Even when you are a part of a marginalized community, you as an individual are not the figurehead. While I obviously focus on the negative feedback on Madisyn's video, there were also some positive comments as well. However, I do think that it is safe to say that based on the comment section at least, this was not a popular sentiment. The voices of those who are not directly impacted by certain issues should not be the loudest, but there is utility in hearing them. It pushes us to refine our messages, know what parts of our arguments need to be reworked for clarity, and it contributes to an overall better collective understanding. But it is still not an excuse to ignore the voices of those you've harmed or hurt. As autistic people, we don't get to decide when, why, or how autistic people get to feel some type of way. As cisgender people, we don't get to decide when, how, or why trans or non-binary people get to feel some type of way. I feel like Madisyn's true reasoning for making this video is not the comments of her being low-key diagnosed on the Clock app. I feel like it is showcased here.
I want to say a white, they, them, 22-year-old that lives in Bushwick who goes by the name of Sock is just not really experiencing the same kind of pain that a black woman in America is facing. You know what I mean?
There's animosity towards white people who intentionally attempt to marginalize themselves because they often become the center focus. Madisyn's video was not directed at people who identify as trans or non-binary or the autistic. It was targeting people who seem to lie about their identities in exchange for community affirmation. That kind of topic will always be kind of sticky because you can accidentally demoralize certain communities, especially if you become too enamored with being humorous or entertaining.
Autism is becoming more normalized and people are more open about it, but like, you know what's also more normalized? The fact that like most of the population has a strain of herpes. Like we kind of are all aware of that now, but no one's putting herpes positive in their Instagram bio.
I personally don't believe Madisyn to be transphobic or ableist or anything of that nature, and you can see her generally good-natured disposition reflected in her audience's approach in critiquing her. I can only hope that when I make mistakes on YouTube that my audience will be as thoughtful as Madisyn's. And that is it for me today, guys. Remember to like and subscribe because I didn't say it before, and until next time, bye.